Throughout the 12th of September 1942, Seydlitz and Kemp's forces cleared the Soviets from most of the high ground west and southwest of the city. The 389th Infantry Division slowly advanced eastward, pressing Group Andrusienko deeper into the Orlovka salient. South of this position, other units of the 51st Army Corps pushed Soviet forces towards the hills west of the city. According to Beaver, a senior sergeant in the 6th Guards Tank Brigade now decided to kill his company commander. After doing so, he then threatened his own tank driver and radio operator with his pistol. These two men were compelled to leave the tank, and the sergeant then drove it alone towards the German 76th Infantry Division's lines, with a white flag stuck out of the turret. The two men who'd got out of the tank were deemed by the Soviet authorities to have displayed cowardice and faced a military tribunal. Beaver says they were probably shot, but it's not clear if they were. Still, the incident highlights the collapse of morale on the Soviet side and the desperation of the authorities to keep order at this time. It also highlights the fact that old histories of this battle mistakenly thought that the 76th Infantry Division took part in the battle for the city, which it didn't. The 76th Infantry Division was further along the Don. As Glantz himself discovered during the writing of his Stalingrad trilogy, and as he explains in a lecture you can find online, he discovered that the 76th Infantry Division didn't take part in the fighting for the city of Stalingrad.
No more than a third of 6th Army was ever involved in the fighting for the city. In every book that's been written on the Battle of Stalingrad for the last 30 years, as included in the German order of battle, a 76th Infantry Division attacking into the city wasn't there. I finally discovered in my research why it's in all those books. Because Chwinkov put it in his book. He was the Army commander that defended. He put it in his book in 1958, in the Russian edition. And you know what? It wasn't his fault. I now have the intelligence reports of 62nd Army. And guess what? The Soviets did think the 76th Infantry was there. This is how a fact can honestly make its way into a history book and then get propelled right on through. And there are legions of these facts in all the existing histories, these mistakes, I should say, in all the existing histories of Stalingrad.
Below the Zaritsa River, Hoth's forces struck eastward against the 244th Rifle Division, the 10th Rifle Brigade, the 10th NKVD Rifle Division's 271st Regiment, and the 35th Guards Rifle Division. The Soviets were so desperate to stop this advance that Bubnov's tankless 133rd Tank Brigade was thrown in to reinforce this sector. 14th Panzer Division, with the Romanian 20th and the German 297th and 371st Infantry Divisions, battled against the defences of several divisions and brigades from 64th Army, but didn't go anywhere. The 24th Panzer Division did manage to take the leather factory, which was just west of Stalingrad suburbs, but Soviet counterattacks prevented them from going any further. It should be obvious, though, that the German offensive towards Stalingrad over the past few days hadn't been the rapid thrust and bold blitzkrieg that the German generals had hoped it should have been. It ended up being more of a step-by-step affair where they inched the front line forwards towards their objective. The Bewegungskrieg warfare, the movement warfare that we've witnessed previously, was gone, and the attritional struggle for the city had now started, even before they'd reached the city. Even now, as the 6th Army's Chief of Staff makes clear, the ferocity of the fighting over the past few days had reached a level such as none of the troops involved had yet experienced in this war. And this was because the Soviets were determined to hold on to Stalingrad. To the north, Soviet rocket, mortar and artillery fire rained down upon the 564th kilometre station area, and Soviet infantry supported by 8 tanks attacked. They were repulsed and lost half their tanks, and this was the final dregs of the offensive that had been going on for several days. Finally, late on the 12th of September 1942, Zhukov ordered his armies to go onto the defensive. So, the first Kotlebane offensive was over. and it had resulted in complete failure, at least on the tactical level. Apparently, no casualty figures have been released for the 4 Soviet armies taking part in the first Kotlebane offensive, but Glantz says that perhaps 1/3 of the 250,000 men taking part in the action, so roughly 80,000 men, and as many as 300 of the 400 Soviet tanks had been lost. This is a ridiculous number of men and material, especially when we consider that the Germans didn't suffer anywhere near that number of casualties. I also don't have complete casualty numbers for Wiedersheim's corps either, but as a rough estimate, 3rd and 60th Motorised and 16th Panzer Divisions probably lost around 3,000 men in total, maybe slightly higher, especially if you count other casualties from within the corps, not just the divisions. Other German forces also defended to the west, although that wasn't the focus of the Soviet attack, so we can probably add another 1,000 or so casualties onto the German count there. So we're talking somewhere in the region of about 4,000 men, maybe a bit more. But no matter the figure, it's nothing compared to the Soviet casualties. On the 11th, the number of panzers that they had left was 26 in 3rd Motorised, 22 in 60th Motorised, and 58 in 16th Panzer Divisions. This is in contrast to the 34 panzers 3rd Motorised had on the 5th of September, the 33 that 60th Motorised had on the 4th of September, and I don't have the numbers for the 16th Panzer Division, but even if they had lost 20 tanks, which would be a high estimate, that's still only about 40 tanks in total lost for the Germans. Now, I've talked about this before, but the Germans don't record their losses correctly. What they do is just state how many operational tanks they have. So if they lost 5 tanks in combat one day, but then repaired 4 of them before the census was taken, then we'd only see that they lost 1 tank, not 5. Yes, the Germans had repaired the other tanks, so they don't count as total losses, but the point is that the Soviets were doing damage to the German tanks, and we just can't tell how much. So they may have lost more tanks in combat than the 40 they listed, let's say 80, and then repaired half of them, leaving the 40 missing, which we can then see in the statistics. So that's something to bear in mind. But even with this, the Germans were only down by about 40 tanks after the first Kotlebane offensive, which is clearly nothing compared to the 300 tanks lost on the Soviet side. When the offensive was later assessed, Soviet commanders themselves admitted that they had lost high numbers of both men and material, and that their attacks had gone nowhere. Rodmistrov, commander of the 7th Tank Brigade, said that his force had suffered 400 casualties. 3rd Motorised Division claimed to have knocked out 355 Soviet tanks, 61 guns, and 67 Katyushas, while capturing 3,939 prisoners for a loss of 710 casualties of its own. Their tank claim is probably a little high, but not by much, and this just shows how futile the first Kotlebane offensive was. On a tactical level, it had achieved nothing. The only question is, did it have a significant impact on the German advance on Stalingrad? We'll come back to that question later. Now, Zhukov and Vasilevsky had previously been summoned to meet with Stalin, and they arrived at the Kremlin on this day. Zhukov made his excuses. He assured Stalin that the 24th, 1st Guards and 66th Armies were effective fighting formations, but they had lacked the manpower, artillery and armour support, so basically everything, that they had needed to reach their objectives. He also complained that the terrain was unfavourable and that the enemy was able to hide in the ravines and command the heights, allowing them ample opportunity to smash the Soviet troops with concentrated small arms and artillery fire. There was no way that these armies could break through the German defence. Zhukov said that they would need an entire new army, another tank corps, 3 more tank brigades, at least 400 artillery pieces, and an entire air army if they were to have any hope of reaching Stalingrad. Vasilevsky apparently supported Zhukov's assessment. But according to Zhukov and Vasilevsky, as Stalin studied the map for solutions, Zhukov and Vasilevsky moved away from the table and started to discuss quietly whether there might be another option, another solution. "What other solution?" Stalin asked, raising his head suddenly. I had never imagined Stalin had such a keen ear. We came back to the table. According to Zhukov, Stalin ordered them to go away and think about this other solution and then report back to him on the evening of the next day. But I want to point out here that everything I've just told you about this meeting could be false. It's questionable whether this other solution was proposed at this time, and Anton Jolly has informed me that there's no record that Zhukov visited the Kremlin between the 31st of August and the 26th of September. And there's also no record that Vasilevsky went to the Kremlin between the 9th and the 21st of September. So it's doubtful that a meeting even took place, let alone the idea that there was a proposed other solution. We'll get into this debate in the future when it becomes apparent that this meeting couldn't have happened due to the events during the battle. But it's worth me mentioning it at this time and then pointing out that it didn't happen. Otherwise, there'll be a bunch of people screaming at me in the comments saying that I'm wrong. So don't worry, put your pitchforks down, all will be explained as events unfold. However, one thing that definitely happened on this day was that Chuikov arrived at the Southeastern Front's HQ at Yami in the morning of the 12th of September. During a brief conversation, Yeremenko appointed Chuikov as the new commander of the 62nd Army and gave him a rudimentary outline of the tactical situation. Then Khrushchev said, "Comrade Chuikov, how do you interpret your task?" Chuikov replied, "We cannot surrender the city to the enemy because it is extremely valuable to us, to the whole Soviet people. The loss of it would undermine the nation's morale. All possible measures will be taken to prevent the city from falling. I don't ask for anything now, but I would ask the military council not to refuse me help when I ask for it, and I swear I shall stand firm. We will defend the city or die in the attempt." Glantz doubts whether this was what he actually said, and it might be that Chuikov made this up later for dramatic effect. There are also other alternative accounts of this meeting, but they're all equally as questionable. So there's definitely an air of propaganda here with regards to the details. Either way though, what is certain is that Chuikov accepted his appointment and became the new commander of the 62nd Army. They invited me to stay for lunch, I declined. We said goodbye. I wanted to be left alone as quickly as possible to ponder on whether I had not rated myself and my powers too highly. I felt very acutely the full weight of the responsibility placed upon me. I had been honoured with a gigantic and extremely difficult task since the enemy was already on the outskirts of the city. Chuikov left Yeremenko's HQ and made his way to the Volga to catch a ferry at Krasnaya Sloboda. Here he describes the crossing. Our ferry skirts round the sandy spit of land jutting out north of Golodny Island and heads for the central landing stage. Shells occasionally burst in the water. They are firing aimlessly. It is not dangerous. We come in close to the bank. From a distance we can see that our ferry approaches. The landing stage fills with people. They are bringing the wounded out of trenches, craters and dugouts, and people are crowding round with bundles and cases. Until the ferry approached, they had been taking cover in trenches, shell holes and bomb craters. All of these people have stern faces, black with dust and streaked with tears. Children racked with thirst and hunger no longer cry, but merely whimper, trailing their little hands in the water. One's heart contracts and a lump comes into one's throat. Chuikov drove in a truck with covered headlights through the burned out city as fires lit the way. The streets of the city are dead. There is not a single green twig left on the trees. Everything has perished in the flames. All that is left of the wooden houses is a pile of ashes and stove chimneys sticking up out of them. The many stone houses are burnt out, their windows and doors missing and roofs caved in. Now and then, a building that is still standing collapses. People are rummaging about in the ruins, pulling out bundles, samovars and crockery, and carrying everything to the landing stage. Chuikov reached his new HQ on the slope of Mamayev Kurgan, where he met his new army chief of staff, Krylov. Chuikov continues the story. Krylov's dugout, strictly speaking, is not a dugout at all, but a broad trench with a bench made of packed earth along one side, a bed made of earth on the other, and a table made of earth at the end of the bed. The roof is made of brushed wood with bits of straw sticking through it, and on top of the straw a layer of soil about 12 to 15 inches thick. Shells and mortar bombs are exploding nearby. The explosions make the dugout shake and soil runs down through the ceiling onto the spread out maps and on the heads of the people inside. There are 2 people in the dugout, General Krylov with a telephone in his hand, and the telephonist on duty, Elena Bakarevich, a blue-eyed girl of about 18. Krylov is having strong words with someone or other. His voice is hard, loud, angry. The telephonist is sitting near the entrance with headphones on answering someone. He is speaking on the other telephone. I take out my papers and put them in front of Krylov. Continuing to tell someone off, he glances at the papers, then finishes the conversation, and we introduce ourselves. In the poor light of a paraffin lamp, I see a vigorous, stern, and at the same time friendly face. You see, Comrade Commander, without my permission, the commander of an armoured formation has transferred his command post from Hill 107.5 right to the bank of the Volga. In other words, the formation's command post is now behind us. It's disgraceful. Chuikov studied Krylov's map and listened to Krylov as Krylov continued to answer telephones. I realise that he has no time to give me a report on the situation in peace and quiet. I have to trust Krylov. I do not disturb his operations or alter his plans for tomorrow because in any case, necessary or not, there is nothing I am capable of changing. A veteran of Odessa and Sevastopol, Krylov had extensive experience in organising desperate defences against German assaults, so Chuikov was certainly right to trust him at this moment in time. The third member of the command team was member of the military council, in other words Commissar Gorov. At this stage of the conflict, commissars were still more hatchetmen than cheerleaders, motivating by fear more than by patriotic fervour. So, the leadership of the 62nd Army for the Battle of Stalingrad was now fixed. Chuikov, Krylov and Gorov. These were the stars of the show. The question is, would they be able to do what was needed? Would they be able to stop the Germans? And would they be able to defend the city of Stalingrad? On the evening of the 12th of September 1942, Hitler called a conference at his headquarters in the Ukraine. In attendance were Hitler, Paulus, von Weichs, Keitel, Jodl, Halder, Heusinger and Wagner. Beaver, Glantz and the official German history note that the generals all told different versions of this conference that don't match up with each other. Accounts of this conference are somewhat suspect considering that the participants tended to blame Hitler for their subsequent defeats. Due to its importance in several critical ways, we're going to try and piece this conference together with the evidence that we have, because not only does it impact the Battle of Stalingrad, but it also pins the blame on Madman Hitler and or Paulus. And it also impacts the entire 1942 and 1943 campaigns, as well as possibly the outcome of the entire war. So just to leave it as the accounts differ simply isn't good enough. This was one of the most important conferences that determined not only the immediate tasks for Paulus's army, but the Wehrmacht's plans in the Stalingrad area as a whole. Now, normally what I do is give you all the evidence first, then discuss it, and then provide you with a theory and come to a conclusion. The reason I do it this way is so that you can come to your own conclusions along the way. But because every account of this conference doesn't match the others, it's just going to confuse you if I give you all the different accounts without at least a working theory to tie it all together. So instead of my normal method, what I'm going to do is give you my theory first, then read through the evidence, and then discuss it at the end. I'm happy to state that my theory could be wrong, but it's not a complicated theory, Occam's razor, and I think there's reasonable evidence to suggest that it is correct, or at least it isn't a million miles away from the truth. Okay, here's what I think happened at the conference. The issue of the exposed Don flank was brought up, but Halder had told Hitler, either at the conference or before, that Stalingrad would fall in about 10 days. Based on this estimate, Hitler, Halder and von Weichs decided that Stalingrad should be captured first before they dealt with the bridgehead at Serafimovich or raced off to Astrakhan. However, when Paulus gave his report on the situation at Stalingrad, Hitler asked Paulus when he thought the city would fall. Paulus replied that his troops were worn out and he couldn't give a date for the capture of the city. He even requested more reinforcements. All of this went against Halder's assessment that the city would fall in 10 days. And worse, Halder didn't have any reinforcements to give to Paulus. So, Halder reacted to Paulus by transferring 3 divisions from the 4th Panzer Army to the 6th Army because they were the only reinforcements that he could provide Paulus. And since Halder had suggested it, Hitler approved of it. This obviously makes Halder and von Weichs the guilty party here, and gets Hitler and Paulus largely off the hook for what happened at Stalingrad during this period. It then becomes clear that Halder and von Weichs decided to lie about what happened at the conference to cover up their own mistakes, which is why their accounts are contradictory. So, with this working theory, let's go through the evidence and see if it all matches up. According to von Weichs' account, nothing of importance was discussed at the conference, except for things that were due to happen once Stalingrad fell. Not only does this confirm that the general opinion was that Stalingrad would fall quickly, but von Weichs' account also contradicts the other accounts, which we'll get to, and it's obvious that he's just trying to deny what was said at the conference. Weichs then says that an attack on Astrakhan was out of the question due to the lack of fresh drinking water on the steppe. This is a questionable excuse at best, but again does suggest that they were discussing what to do once Stalingrad fell quickly. He talks about the creation of a Romanian army group after Stalingrad fell, which we've discussed before. He also says that when Paulus brought up the problem of the long Don flank which threatened Army Group B, that Hitler simply failed to grasp the problem, or rejected his concerns entirely. And according to this version, the resistance at Stalingrad, Hitler asserted, was a purely local affair. Of course, von Weichs clearly doesn't have an excuse as to why Hitler would just dismiss the exposed Don flank issue, which is why he resorted to using the Madman Hitler card to get himself out of jail for free. Hitler, the guy who's risen from nothing to conquer most of Europe, was supposedly so dumb that he couldn't even grasp the Don flank problem. Anyone with 2 brain cells to rub together can grasp the Don flank problem, so Hitler could probably grasp it as well. In fact, you may recall from a couple of episodes ago now how on the 9th of September, Hitler had ordered Army Group B's Don flank to be strengthened as much as possible and mined, because he expected strong enemy attacks in the winter from that direction. He'd also been the one to originally order the 22nd Panzer Division to bolster the flank in August. Halder also reported that Hitler was concerned about the Don flank on the 16th of September in a few days' time, so clearly Hitler was concerned about the Don flank, contradicting von Weichs' account. But there were a couple of reasons as to why Hitler may not have been overly worried about the flank during this conference. The first is that he had already ordered the flank to be strengthened and mined, as we just said, but also he had just been told by Halder that Stalingrad would fall in 10 days, and therefore they had plenty of time to sort out the Don flank problem before the strong enemy attacks came in the winter. This is also why he said that the resistance at Stalingrad was purely a local affair, because he genuinely believed that the city would fall quickly based on Halder's assessment. Glantz also comes to a similar conclusion, stating that Hitler didn't think the Soviets were capable of launching a major counteroffensive at this time based on all the defeats of previous months and their intelligence information. So this supports the idea of taking Stalingrad first, then dealing with the Don flank problem. According to Paulus's account, recorded while he was in Soviet captivity, he says that Hitler closed the meeting by saying, "The Russians are on the verge of exhaustion. The resistance at Stalingrad should be assessed only as of local importance. They are no longer capable of retaliatory actions of a broad strategic nature which could be dangerous for us. In addition, the northern flank on the Don will receive significant reinforcements from the Allied forces. Under these circumstances, I see no serious danger for the northern front. For the rest, care must be taken to quickly take the city into our hands and not allow it to turn into a durable, all-consuming fire." Obviously, the Axis Allied forces weren't exactly elite troops, but the point is that Hitler was reinforcing the flank, and he didn't think, based on intelligence reports, which we'll come back to at a later date, that the Soviets would be able to mount a serious strategic counteroffensive at this moment. In another account, it is said that Paulus and von Weichs arrived to find Hitler convinced that the Battle of Stalingrad was almost over, suggesting that Halder had told Hitler that the battle would be over in just 10 days. Paulus and von Weichs then gave their report of the situation, saying that there would be difficulty in capturing the city, after which Hitler then asked Paulus when did he think the city would fall. "When will you hold in your hands the city and the Volga bank within the city? It is important for me that this happens soon." According to Anthony Beevor and Craig, Paulus presumably stated that he could take Stalingrad in 10 days of fighting. Even Beevor says that Paulus presumably said the 10-day prediction, meaning he doubts that Paulus actually said it. And this account says that Paulus and von Weichs told Hitler that they would have difficulty in capturing the city, which doesn't imply that they thought they would capture the city in just 10 days. Having difficulty capturing it, but we'll take it in just 10 days, is a bit of a contradiction, suggesting that they didn't say this, and that maybe Halder did. Also, if the city would fall in just 10 days, why then would Hitler give Paulus reinforcements? Hitler reinforced Paulus with 3 divisions from 4th Panzer Army. Why would he do this if Paulus was confident that the city was about to fall anyway? This doesn't make any sense. It's more likely that Paulus didn't think the city would fall, which is why he asked for reinforcements, and then Hitler granted that request. So again, this suggests Paulus didn't say that the city would fall in 10 days. Von Weichs' account also tells us that Hitler had been convinced before Paulus and von Weichs had even arrived that the Battle of Stalingrad was non-important, suggesting Halder was the one who said the 10-day prediction, and Weichs also doesn't say that Paulus was the one to say the 10-day prediction. Even Colonel Adam doesn't say that Paulus predicted that the city would fall in 10 days. Instead, throughout his book, he shows Paulus to be quite pessimistic about the prospects of taking the city, leading us to the conclusion that Paulus wouldn't make the 10-day prediction. And in one account, Paulus is recorded as saying, "In light of the reported conditions of our troops who have been worn out in the fighting as well as Russian resistance, I cannot name a final date. Quite the opposite. I must request reinforcements of 3 combat-capable divisions." This is from Paulus's own account that he gave while in Soviet captivity, and thus wasn't influenced by the scheming of the other generals. Anton Jolly has given me an alternate translation of Paulus's words, which reads 3 able divisions. But either way, according to Paulus himself, he didn't say that the city would fall in 10 days. Isayev then notes, in this matter, Paulus failed to support Halder's optimistic calculation for the seizure of Stalingrad within 10 days. So it's incredibly unlikely that Paulus would be the one to predict that the city would fall in 10 days. These are Halder's words being placed in Paulus's mouth to pass the blame from Halder to Paulus. This then goes in line with the next decision, which was that Hitler gave Paulus 3 divisions from Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. But who really decided this? Did Hitler just randomly make this decision, or did someone else suggest it? Well, Paulus requested 3 combat-capable divisions and got 3 not-so-combat-capable divisions, since the ones he received were already depleted from the previous fighting. So this was probably not Paulus's suggestion. And if Hitler just randomly suggested it, why did nobody protest? None of the accounts say that anyone objected to this move, meaning that others, probably higher in rank than Paulus, agreed with it. And Isaev says, Hitler agreed that the matter of reinforcing Paulus must be studied. Halder suggested a decision involving available forces. He stated that the High Command neither had fresh forces nor the prospect of transferring them to Stalingrad in time. Halder's opinion was that there was only one way out, to transfer the formations of the 4th Tank Army, which was south of Stalingrad, to the 6th Army. It really does seem to me that Halder had predicted that the city would fall in 10 days and had told Hitler this. But then Paulus reported that this wasn't the case, contradicting Halder and making him look like an idiot, and asked for reinforcements. Hitler then said that they should reinforce Paulus, which caught Halder off guard. Halder had to admit that there were no reserves and then tried to salvage the situation by suggesting an ad hoc local transfer of 3 depleted divisions from Hoth's army to Paulus. And this view is supported by the fact that Halder later said he wanted to move more forces to Stalingrad. The Chief of the General Staff urged that the main forces be concentrated on the taking of Stalingrad. Now, this account is just a generic statement about Halder's views at the time, and is not specific to this conference, but it is especially interesting because it says that Halder was supposedly the one who advised Hitler to send more units to Stalingrad, rather than Paulus persuading Hitler to send him reinforcements. But it could also be false. At no point in Halder's diary does Halder say that he wants more troops transferred to Stalingrad from elsewhere after the transfer of Hoth's army to the area on the 1st of August. There were also no main forces, as in there was no strategic reserves, so I think he's just referring to a concentration of local forces for the taking of the city. However, it appears that after the war, Halder was caught in a bit of a dilemma. The narrative Halder painted after the war was that if only Madman Hitler had listened to him and sent more units into Stalingrad, then they could have won the battle. Though Halder and then his successor warned Hitler that the troops in Stalingrad were becoming exhausted, the Supreme Commander insisted that they push on. Fresh divisions were thrown in and were soon ground to pieces in the Inferno. Do you see the contradiction here? Halder was calling for more troops to be sent into the Inferno of Stalingrad, and so Hitler does send in more troops. Yet somehow, because the battle is lost, this gets blamed on Hitler. Well, why not blame Halder? Halder was the one pushing the narrative that Madman Hitler should have sent more units into Stalingrad. Well, that's exactly what happened. Halder and Hitler reinforced a defeat. They fed troops into Stalingrad and lost. Madman Hitler did listen to Halder. And when this is pointed out, Halder tries to backtrack. He says, no, I foresaw the trap. You didn't have to have the gift of a prophet, says Halder, to foresee what would happen when Stalin unleashed those 1.5 million troops against Stalingrad and the Don flank. I pointed this out to Hitler very clearly. The result was the dismissal of the Chief of the Army General Staff. And the Chief of the Army General Staff was himself. So he's suggesting that Hitler didn't listen to him, and that Halder was sacked because he had tried to warn Hitler about the Don flank. Well, if you foresaw the trap, Halder, why did you call for the main forces to be concentrated on the taking of Stalingrad? If you knew this was a trap, Why would you want more forces to be sent into it? That makes no sense. Also, trying to explain the Don flank to Hitler wasn't the reason you were dismissed. Hitler had decided to dismiss you in the aftermath of the command crisis on the 7th to 9th of September, before this meeting on the 12th. Halder even confirms this in his own diary. Hints of more changes in high posts, including mine. And the reason why Hitler was getting rid of Halder was because Halder and the rest of the high command had repeatedly failed to do what was asked of them. There was no saving Halder. Hitler complained bitterly to Below that Halder had no comprehension of the difficulties at the front and was devoid of ideas for solutions. He coldly viewed the situation only from maps and had completely wrong notions about the way things were going. This also backs up the idea that Halder had failed to grasp what was happening at Stalingrad, why he had an overly optimistic view of everything, and why he was taken off guard by Paulus saying he needed more reinforcements. He was devoid of ideas for solutions, and therefore just decided to transfer 3 depleted divisions from Hot to Paulus. And I don't think Halder foresaw the trap at Stalingrad, suggesting that he did have completely wrong notions about how things were going. Halder's own diary doesn't reflect any concern about the Don flank, where the Soviet trap would eventually be sprung. In fact, there are something like 18 entries from the 27th of July to the 24th of September 1942, where Halder quite clearly states that the Don flank is all quiet, or there's only minor fighting, or that the entire front is quiet, or something similar. If anything, depending on how you read it, I may have actually undercounted the amount of times he says that the Don flank was fine. There's only a handful of entries where he complains about the Don flank itself, one on the 6th of August when the Hungarians let the Red Army across the Don, and another on the 26th of August when he says that the Italians are in trouble, but even then he says countermeasures were being taken, and on the next day says the threat turned out to be not so serious. There's a couple more where he says part of the Don flank is in a bit of bother, but the other parts of the Don flank are not, such as on the 29th of August. On numerous dates, he doesn't even mention the Don flank at all, and at no point does he say that he's concerned about the flank, or that he's spoken to Hitler about this. So I don't think Halder foresaw the threat of the Don flank. I don't think he fully understood the problem in Stalingrad, which is why he predicted that it would fall in 10 days. I also think he was caught completely off guard by Paulus saying he was having difficulties taking the city and was asking for reinforcements. Put on the spot in front of Hitler at a time when his job was already on the line, he then came up with an impromptu answer, which was to transfer the 3 depleted divisions that Hot had to Paulus. And, of course, this was a bad decision in hindsight, so he later decided that Hitler had to be blamed for this. That's why he played the Madman Hitler card. Put in charge of the US Historical Division, he and other generals tried to cover up what had happened with a host of excuses, flawed and contradictory accounts, and outright lies, including the burning of incriminating documents, to try and pass the blame onto Madman Hitler and Paulus, whose reputation was already in the gutter by that point. These distortions of history then made it impossible for historians to truly reconstruct what happened during this meeting and in other areas of the war, indicating that there was some sort of cover-up. This explains why little random events pop up in the narrative, like this one. That evening, Paulus dined with his old friend Franz Halder. Over good wine, they talked of the successful summer steppe campaign, and Paulus repeated his fears about the weakness of the puppet armies on his left flank. Halder told him he intended to keep after Hitler on the subject, and the two men parted on an optimistic note. Oh really? The only thing the two of you talked about was the Don flank and the so-called successful failure of Fall Blau. Really? Nothing else was discussed at all? Strange that, isn't it? I mean, why would you even mention this meeting? It's not relevant to anything, unless there was no evidence of you trying to tell Hitler about the Don flank, and you needed to insert evidence that you were trying to do this in ways that couldn't be refuted, such as with a random meeting with Paulus where all you happened to discuss was this issue. No, this event is complete rubbish. So, because of all of this, it would seem to be that what actually happened at the conference was that Halder told Hitler that Stalingrad would fall in about 10 days, which prompted Hitler, Halder and von Weichs to decide that Stalingrad should be captured first before they dealt with the Don flank. Paulus, though, said he couldn't give a date for the capture of the city and requested more reinforcements. All of this went against Halder's assessment that the city would fall in 10 days, and Halder could only transfer 3 divisions from the 4th Panzer Army to the 6th Army, which Hitler then approved of. Halder and von Weichs are therefore guilty. Madman Hitler and Paulus are not entirely to blame for what happened, and the problem of the Don flank wasn't exactly ignored, but postponed for after Stalingrad, which Halder himself, contrary to Paulus or Hitler, thought would fall quickly. Now, as I said, this theory could be wrong, but there's evidence in favour of it, and it's not beyond the realm of possibility. It does, at the very least, tie together the various pieces of the puzzle, and regardless, it would be wrong to assume that only Madman Hitler and Paulus were to blame for what happened at Stalingrad. Halder and von Weichs should take the blame as well. It was the night before hell, as Paulus was about to mount his attack into the urban jungle of Stalingrad. The battle we've all been waiting for is about to begin. But notice, even though 3 divisions of Hoth's 4th Panzer Army had been given to Paulus for the assault, only a portion of the 6th Army was actually engaged in the fighting for the city itself. The rest were guarding the Don flank. This obviously isn't good because Paulus really needs to take the city quickly while the Soviets are relatively weak, before they have a chance to reinforce themselves. And because of Zhukov's attacks to the north, only a portion of Wietersheim's 14th Panzer Corps could take part in the fighting for the city. We have 2 Panzer Grenadier battalions from 16th Panzer Division in the north, as well as a 3rd Motorised Battalion and a motorcycle battalion from 60th Motorised Division. These units were largely on the defensive because they were just battalions, but Group Starhill, on the other hand, was an offensive unit, although of questionable quality. Further south, we have the 3 divisions of Seilitz's 51st Army Corps, beginning first with the 389th Infantry Division south of Orlovka, then the 295th Infantry Division west of Stalingrad's factory districts, then the 71st Infantry Division as well. Even further south, we have Kemp's 48th Panzer Corps with the 24th Panzer Division, the 94th Infantry Division and the 29th Motorised Division. It's worth noting that the depleted 14th Panzer Division was turned south to operate against the Bigotovka bridgehead, and so didn't participate in the street fighting. Therefore, despite the fact that some older Soviet sources claim that the Germans had a lot more troops and tanks than they really did, they claimed that they had 500 panzers, in reality Paulus's offensive force of 4 infantry divisions, 1 motorised and 1 panzer division, plus some other elements, only had about 80,000 men and 110 panzers and stugs. The 62nd Army was equally as depleted, with only 54,000 men and slightly more than 50 tanks. However, many of the men on both sides were assigned to rear service duties, so the actual combat units were massively under strength. And while Chuikov may have had more than 50 tanks, Glantz thinks they had more than 100, as Isaev points out, a lot of the Soviet tanks were already immobilised and would be lost relatively quickly when the front shifted. Most of the remaining Soviet tanks were consolidated into Popov's 23rd Tank Corps, which was in the north, so it's not too inaccurate to say that they didn't have that many tanks. But whichever way you look at it, it's clear that Paulus's attacking force significantly outnumbered Churikov's defenders at the start of the city fight. And that's probably surprising to hear for many people, considering that we in the West have been given this impression that the Soviets in Stalingrad sent wave after wave of riflemen to slowly wear down the Germans over time. Well, bit of a spoiler, while the Soviets did receive reinforcements, they never received enough troops to just waste them like that. As we go through the battle, you'll see that the old narrative simply doesn't hold up to scrutiny. It's also worth clarifying, as both Isaev and Glantz report, that while some of Churikov's units were operating at 20 to 25% of their strength, with many just fielding hundreds instead of thousands of men, a lot of them weren't quite as impoverished as Churikov made them out to be in his memoirs. Only one of the divisions had less than 200 men. A few were in the 450 to 900 man range, but more than half had 1 or up to 4,000 men, which is way more than the 200 or 300 men that Churikov claimed were in each of his divisions. The 10th NKVD had 8,600 men at this time, and some of the rifle brigades actually had over 4,000 men. Yes, there were brigades with more men than divisions. Yet, even though he had slightly more men than he had claimed, Churikov's 62nd Army was on its last legs. Krylov, though, had formed a continuous line to protect the city from all directions. Yes, that line was thin and lacked artillery or an effective communication system to coordinate the defence, but it was a line nonetheless, and there were a lot of units ready to hold the city. Starting from the north, Group Gorokov was in a position from Rynok to Orlovka, as Group Andrusienko was in the Orlovka salient itself, along with separate battalions from nearby rifle brigades. Because Orlovka and Rynok remained in Soviet hands, and because of the offensives to the north, the 14th Panzer Corps would be in no position to advance into Stalingrad. As subsequent fighting would indicate, the Panzer Corps' failure to capture the factory district would have immensely negative ramifications for Paulus's efforts to capture the city. Opposite the 389th Rifle Division, below Group Andrusienko, were 2 battalions, one each from the 124th and 149th Rifle Brigades, making this a pretty weak area in the Soviet defensive line. South of this position was the composite regiment that had been the 112th Rifle Division, and below that, on the heights west of Stalingrad, were the various units of the 23rd Tank Corps. The remnants of the 87th Rifle Division, about 200 riflemen, had been given to the 6th Guards Tank Brigade to boost their numbers. Below the 23rd Tank Corps, near the Stalingrad airfield, was the 6th Tank Brigade, not to be confused with the 6th Guards Tank Brigade, which was further north. South of the tanks, there was the 42nd Naval Rifle Brigade, and 1 regiment from the 244th Rifle Division that was north of the Tsaritsa River. South of the Tsaritsa River were the 2 remaining regiments of 244th Rifle Division, below that the 10th Rifle and 133rd Tank Brigades, then the 271st NKVD regiments from 10th NKVD Division, and finally the 35th Guards and 131st Rifle Divisions. Technically there was still a slight connection with the 64th Army, which was further south, but this wouldn't last for long, so I've not represented it on the map. As you may have noticed, the NKVD regiments of 10th NKVD Rifle Division were spread evenly throughout the city, but this wasn't a regular rifle division, which is why Sarajevo only had 12 artillery guns and mortars. They did have the 28th Detachment of Tank Destroyer Dogs attached to them, who would fight bravely in the coming days, but clearly the 10th NKVD was starved of heavy guns. Luckily though, Krylov had organised artillery and mortar groups on the other side of the Volga to provide fire support, and the Volga Flotilla's 1st Brigade was also there to help out the army's right wing with naval gunfire. What's interesting is that, because the Soviets were expecting Zhukov's attacks from the north to penetrate through the German lines and reach the defenders, some of the strongest units in the 62nd Army had been placed in the north. This, of course, means that the weaker Soviet units were facing where the main German attacks were coming from, the centre and the south, which would obviously have an impact on the upcoming battle. The defence of the southern part of Stalingrad, the elevator area, was the weakest. So this was the situation on the eve of the urban street fighting in Stalingrad. Both armies were worn out, both faced significant problems, all the troops were exhausted and lacking in ammunition and other equipment. The fighting had been raging for weeks prior to this point, and it may even be possible to argue that the turning point of this campaign had already happened. The rapid manoeuvre warfare was over, replaced by static positional set-piece battles. Yet there was still a potential for the Germans to take the city, since their best units were moving into the south, the weakest point of the city, and this is why Hott was confident that the troops now transferred to Paulus' 6th Army would quickly win the battle before them. The battle around Stalingrad has reached its climax. Thanks to the extraordinary achievement of the troops, in 3 weeks of fighting we have succeeded in pushing up to the edge of the city and encircling it from the south and west. It is now vital to take Stalingrad together with the neighbours, and with that, complete the defeat of the enemy. The fame won will be unforgettable for you, the German army and your descendants. It comes down to each man. Everyone will double their strength. The weight of German weapons will break the last of the enemy's will to resist. Long live the Führer! Little did he realise that the fighting for Stalingrad had only just begun. Thanks for watching, bye for now.